Hi, I know this has been probably a long day for everyone, so thank you for staying with us and hanging out with us today. My name is Shay Cornett. I host First Take and Sports Center at ESPN. And I'm like you, I'm going to learn a few things right now, too. So, we're going to discuss a lot about sports, specifically women's sports, and just how the game has changed and how it continues to grow and the way we are viewing fandom and viewership and all of it. And so, the two on my left are far more important than I. And so, they're going to spit some knowledge at everybody today. So, first, we are so lucky to have Rita Farrow. She leads all global advertising sales for Disney's portfolio of entertainment, news, sports properties, Disney's linear, digital, ad-supported streaming businesses. Her resume is like this entire card, just so you know. She's very important. So this is Rita. We're going to give it up for Rita.
Hi, everybody.
Okay, and then Susie Petrowski is next to her. She's vice president of the women's sports programming with ESPNW for ESPN. That's our women's branch of ESPN. She's responsible for leading the company's women's sports strategy. She drives businesses and the future vision of ESPN's women's in sports. So Susie and Rita here are going to tell us a lot about the future of women's sports, which is so exciting. So I'm going to start with Susie, and then I think Rita will just piggyback off a little bit. But as we all know, women's sports has just been evolving and really been the kind of the epicenter of sports for us at ESPN. And the way it's changed over the last couple of years has been so cool to sit back and watch from a host perspective and also from a fan perspective. And so, Susie, just like let's set the stage. Why? Why are we investing in women's sports? How? Why? How did this come about? Like, just let's set the stage for what it's become now.
Well, first and foremost, it's great business. The days of women's sports being the right thing to do or a charity case are very far over. Yeah, see, I knew this was going to be a great crowd for women's sports. And I've been at ESPN for just over 3 years, and candidly, it's the portfolio of women's sports at ESPN are why I took the job. So we like to say it's a 30-year overnight success. We've had a deal with the WNBA since 1999. And how many of you guys are watching the WNBA playoffs right now? And for us, we have all of, from a priority property standpoint, you can't be a fan of women's sports without us. 68% of women's sports consumption comes by way of ESPN. That includes the NWSL, WNBA, every NCAA women's championship, Athletes Unlimited, League One volleyball. Again, you cannot be a fan of women's sports without ESPN, and it's driving our business. I think Rita can put a very fine point on this, but the revenue best opportunity in many cases is tied to women's sports, and we're really kind of meeting the demand, and if anything, we're running out of supply because the demand is so robust.
That's right. And what you've seen is really 5 years ago, you had a couple of brands who would come in, no one bigger than Ally Bank and Andrea Brimmer being at the forefront of making a pledge to make sure that, within a very specific period of time, she would be 50% in men's sports, 50% in women's sports. She's now reached that level. And it's really exciting to see the brands that have followed, everybody from Cap One to Eli Lilly to Google, brands, major brands who understand that this is important for business. It's not exactly what Susie said. It's not because it's the right thing to do. It's because it's moving the needle. And you're seeing it in terms of audience growth, right? And so you've continued to see significant duplication of budget and audiences coming to these sports. And just in this year's upfront, I mean, we had 100% growth in investments for women's sports and advertising dollars because there is a limited supply, right? And so people want to make sure that they have their position inside the sports that are resonating with the audiences that matter.
Rita, I'm going to stay with you here too, and Susie, you can comment on this as well. I know from a host perspective, like we have placement of women's sports now in these primetime shows, right? Like on Sports Center, on Pat McAfee, whatever it is. Like we're talking women's sports. It doesn't matter what show it is across ESPN platforms. How has that changed?
It's huge. So let's just talk some numbers for a second. You're seeing college football is up overall 30%, among women 35%. NFL is up 24%, among women 35%. Shows like College Game Day up 20-some%, among women almost 40%. Like women are finding sports, they're showing up, they're spending time, they are huge fans, they're driving engagement, they are part of the conversation socially, they're participating in fantasy. All of the experiences that surround not only the live events, but the spirit and enthusiasm around sports, women are driving that conversation. And it's really important as brands start to look at where audiences are going and where they should be spending their advertising dollars to make sure that the messages are right, the creative is right, that it speaks to the importance of the knowledge that women have around sports. Because I think there was always like, okay, we'll program to the guy and if the woman is there. No longer. You're seeing creative that's really made for the female sports consumer who understands, who's driving the purchase decisions in the home. We're going to have a massive shift in who's making those decisions in the home and in wealth transfer in the next couple of years. And so brands that understand that are really spending time understanding where they need to place those dollars. And women's sports is a great opportunity, but so is the NFL, so is the NBA, so is college sports.
And Shay, what my job is really kind of developing a strategy holistically for women's sports. So what does that mean? It is mainstreaming women's sports across our established ecosystem. That's having Pat McAfee talk about women's sports. That's Stephen A. talking about women's sports. Because we're ESPN and we cover the best of sports, and women's sports are sports. Historically, they've been treated differently. Now we know that growth is good, scale is better. And now we are getting to scale across the entirety of our portfolio. So in the A block of First Take during Women's Final Four, guess what we're going to be talking about?
Let's
We're going to
go.
be talking about the competition on the court, right? So that's really kind of what our strategy is tied to, is ensuring that we are serving sports fans anytime, anywhere, and women's sports is core to that.
Okay, so let's focus in on what's going on right now, which is the WNBA finals, right? Which we know and we love, and that also has grown. And as we talk about women's fandom and women's sports growing amongst all different sports, obviously the WNBA and women's college basketball and all things along those lines are evolving as well. And so the overall sports programming growth with the WNBA, Susie, can you talk about how that has changed?
I mean, it's top of our pyramid, right? Women's basketball is the top of our pyramid from a consumption standpoint. On the men's side, we have football, we have college football, we have the NFL. What's the top of our pyramid? It's women's basketball. So let's look at our regular season as an example. Most watched WNBA regular season in our network's history, right? And I think it's really important. I view this as part of my job. It's dispelling anything, maybe any inaccuracies, right? This is a star-driven league. The Caitlin Clark effect is incredibly real. I am incredibly grateful for what Caitlin Clark has done for the WNBA, that has done for women's basketball. Caitlin's been out since July. We still had the most watched WNBA regular season. We just concluded the most watched WNBA semifinals. We were up double digits. Compared to 2023, we were up over 200%. So I think it speaks to the sustainability of our women's portfolio holistically.
But I also think the reason that basketball is so important too is we also have the women's Final Four, right? And so we're starting when they're rising, we're capturing those stars, we're understanding how to tell their stories, and then we're following them through into the NBA to really be able to amplify those stories and voices. And so it's really the investment that ESPN has made in women's sports, nobody else has done. And that's investment, by the way, not only around the athletes, but it's also around the talent covering the athletes. We have incredible on front of the camera talent, but we also have incredible behind the scenes camera talent. When you look at Jimmy Pitaro's leadership table, his head of programming, his head of comms, his head of sales, his head of legal, his CFO, all women. So that conversation is being had at the
Love to
most
see it.
senior
All women.
levels.
Yeah.
Women are given a seat at the table to represent the importance of women's sports and the female consumer at that table.
So that kind of taps on like the women's sports strategy that we have at ESPN. And I think obviously women having a seat at the table makes a big difference, right? Like your voice is obviously heard if you're there as opposed to when you're not there. But the way that we strategize how women's sports is going to be consumed or how fans are going to react to it. Susie, can you hit on that?
I think it's about accessibility, right? The barrier to entry to be a women's sports fan historically has been incredibly high, right? Production quality has been rather low. It's behind a paywall. That's not the case anymore. As we finish this year, if we go the distance on this finals, we'll have had, let me make sure I get my statistics right, 30 games on ABC, and I think we're up 5 games by comparison to last year on ESPN. That's more premium windows, more primetime location. And I'm sometimes hesitant to use primetime as opposed to premium, right? We have our women's Final Four, our championship at a 3:30 position on ABC on Sundays. I'll take that. I'll take that any day of the week because we have a younger, more diverse fandom of women's sports holistically. So I think you'll continue to see more premium windows to make this sport, to make our portfolio more accessible. And we'll continue to do that, again, in large part because it's driven by sales, it's driven by demand, and it's driven by the demand of the consumer.
If you want to dive into that a little
Yeah,
bit too. And when we
I-
talk about the consumer, she hit on it too. Younger is always better, I think, too,
That's
because you're
right.
growing up with the sport.
That's right. And I think the other thing that you're seeing in the evolution of how we tell those stories is there's a lot more technology involved in how we're covering the games, before the games, during the games, and after. The ability to really input statistics into the coverage of the games, to really add brands where the action is happening, to follow it through on fantasy, on sports betting, on social, making sure that we have the best highlight clips, all of that shared across our social feeds, as well as our recent launch of ESPN the app, which is extraordinarily helpful for us as a sports enthusiast and sports fans, but also to give windows of, that is a premium position, right? So like when we talk about prime time, our ESPN app is the ultimate fan destination for sports consumers, and it gives premium windows to everything on there. Well, now we have the ability to put every single game that we have and give it a prime window in that app experience with the coverage, the highlights, the incredible technology behind all of the opportunity it's created by being part of that experience. And so more and more you will start to see greater coverage, more amplification, and more technology really influencing how we're covering those games.
When you look at the consumer for women's sports, and we touched on this a little bit about how they've changed and how they evolved, but even in just like the last 2 or 3 years, how would you say the consumer for women's sports, male or female, doesn't matter, how do you think that's changed?
There's been a huge misconception historically on who that consumer has been. Candidly, it's been older white guys that were consuming women's sports, especially women's basketball. So we've seen growth among female audiences adjacent to women's sports, of course, but adjacent to all sports, NFL, college
right.
football. So again, that consumer is younger, diverse. When brands are kind of investing, investing, let's use WNBA as an example, people are more likely to spend with that brand because it represents their identity. It represents causes that they care about. The women's sports fan moves different. And I think that's kind of what we're uncovering these days is, okay, what does it mean? What does an identity of a women's sports fan look like? I see an everyone watches women's sports shirt in the audience. I'm sure there's a few of them. I'm a diehard New York Giants fan. When I wear a Giants jersey, you just know I'm a Giants fan. When I see an everyone watches women's sports shirt, I know more about who you are as a person. And I think that's really informative for us as the rights holder and as we're educating advertisers on where the opportunity exists across our portfolio.
That's right. And I think you're seeing it more in terms of the amount of platforms coming to the table willing to spend money around women's sports, right? Before it was okay, it might be on a couple of networks here and there. You're now seeing the likes of Amazon and Google and Netflix coming in, chasing the dollars that sports leagues are looking for, and really making a commitment and investment around not only the live rights, which still, by the way, in a sports marketplace, drive the dollars, let's call it what it is, but telling the stories of those athletes and their families and how they got there, like our 30 for 30s that tell the story that people become, fans of and become, followers of sports because of the incredible stories that get told there. Everybody's getting into this game, and you're seeing it right now at a level that you have not seen probably in the last 24 months. Really, really exciting and vibrant. Partially is because of the time of the year. We're in the NBA Finals, WNBA Finals. Partially because now you're seeing brands really move significant money in this direction and understand that sports are growing and women's sports are growing, and they're growing because the female consumer is showing up.
And they might be growing too, because as we mentioned, ESPN was really the first to invest in women's sports, right? Like the history of all of that and the way that's affected consumers and the way people consume women's sports in its totality. Like, how important has that been that we really did, ESPN, get in on the ground floor?
I mean, rights are king, rights are queen, right? Let me correct myself. So yeah, of course, our portfolio is unmatched, but our leadership position is being challenged because everybody wants a piece of it. So we have to deliver for the fan more and more. And I think that's kind of what defines us as a leader. I don't compare ourselves against anyone else. I compare ourselves against ourselves. How do we make it as easy to be a fan of women's sports as it is to be a fan of the NFL? That's what we're working towards. The same level of intensity that we serve that fan, that's what we're working towards in serving the women's sports fan.
I believe also that commitment that we made to NCAA sports and having it across, because when you watch an incredible volleyball game or an incredible softball game, the fandom around those sports is incredible, as big as it is, I think, around basketball. And so the passion around it, it's really, you can see the growth of those sports that maybe a couple of years ago might have had, some interest, but it was very niche. It is far more popular now, and there's incredible momentum. I was watching the softball playoffs, and it was like, holy moly, like these women are incredible athletes, and the guys on my team were super interested in it. And that's where when you start to see guys really talking about women's sports, that's when I get excited, because that's when it's reached a different level of currency in the conversations we're having.
And
wanna-
I'm sorry, Shay,
go
but
ahead.
from a gender breakdown standpoint, our TikTok, our ESPNW TikTok is 50-50 gender split. And our ESPNW Instagram is a 60-40 gender split. By comparison to any of our other brands, from a social standpoint, they're largely 80-20. So I think that certainly speaks to, from a consumption standpoint, it's rather gender balanced. So, it's not necessarily about the little girls, right? Of course, we want to inspire the little girls, but it's about the little girls, it's about the little boys, it's about the girls, the gays, and the theys. That's who we're representing here from a fandom standpoint.
Let's dive a little further into like ad innovation. And some of this might pass us by. Like if you're watching a game or a profile piece or something like that that's covering women's sports, maybe you missed some of this, but the way that ad innovation has taken over women's sports as well has been really intriguing. There's been shoppable moments, interactive ads during live games. And maybe that's reshaping the way we consume things, the way we view things. But is there something that, as we look ahead to the future and the way women's sports is evolving, that excites you from a brand innovation standpoint?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. All those units that you mentioned, right? Because everything that consumers are doing now tends to have like a second screen experience as part of it, which is why when we launched ESPN, the app, we thought about all of those things, right? You want personalization, you want the ability to shop, the ability to bet, the ability to get stats, the ability to share socially, all in one experience. The other piece of that, though, I think that's really interesting is, when you look at our business today, more and more is moving into multi-year commitments because of the power of sports. 2/3 of all of our multi-year deals now include women's sports as part of them. That's a major commitment. That means a brand is saying, I'm not in it for 1 year, I'm in it for the entirety of my relationship with ESPN. And that has radically changed. I could tell you 3 years ago, maybe 5. 2/3 of them now, and we have 70, right? So it's a big number. And those are tens of millions of dollars annually deals, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on the sport. So that has radically changed. And it's changed because technology is enabling them to really position themselves on site. So like when you think of game day, the ability to touch fans in a real life experience. When you think of even Pat McAfee and the extension, College Game Day's growth and the growth of Pat McAfee. And by the way, women watching Pat McAfee, 50% audience growth from Pat McAfee. I'm not sure I would have
Surprised by that. Yeah.
necessarily, exactly. I'm not sure I would have
I
said
know
that. But I think that's a halo from his incredible work on College Game Day and the incredible growth of that franchise. And brands understand I want to be there, but I also want to own a part of that experience and share it socially and make sure there's community around it and make sure that your brand becomes part of the social currency and conversation that happens.
Susie, do you want to talk a little bit about the personalization, like from an ad standpoint or from the way people are consuming women's sports?
I think it's certainly socially driven, right? We see a ton of engagement across our ESPNW socials as an example, but my perspective is all about sustainability. Sometimes the leash is short when we're trying to prove things tied to women's sports, but from a technology standpoint, our leash is long, right? We're building the plane as we're flying it to a degree. We're establishing a more sustainable infrastructure. Again, it's kind of why I took this job. If you can create sustainability and an infrastructure that is sustainable at the institution, we're just getting started, right? We have reestablished floors across the board. You mentioned Women's College World Series. I think we had over 2 million for game 3 of our Women's College World Series up against game 7 on a different network for the NHL Stanley Cup playoffs, right? Our volleyball numbers, record breaking regular season, record breaking, right? So we have raised the floor. Let's look at, obviously, our Caitlin Clark Final Four was over, I think, 19 million viewers, and I think we peaked over 20 million viewers. And we had, I'm a UConn fan, so we had a UConn win, albeit a bit of a blowout this year. But that number, I think we were over 9 million viewers. That previously was the record. And that was kind of what our new floor is. So what we've created is sustainability, and what we've created is a new floor, and we're only going to continue to go up from there.
All right, let's spin this forward, right? In terms of brands and advertising and what more we want to see from women's sports. Like what more do you think that fans want to see? We can do what consumers want to see, however you want to word this. Susie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think, this is really what we're working towards on the ESPNW side. How do we continue to super serve the women's sports fan? I think it's by way of content, it's by way of experiences, it's creating more community. I think women's sports fans for a really long time have had to do it on their own because they've had to work so hard to be a fan. So how do we reward you? Those of you who have been with us from the jump, we want to make sure we take care of you, but we also want to bring everybody with us. So what does that look like? It's more storytelling, it's more complementary content. I think you certainly have seen more surround coverage for us. We can look at WNBA Countdown as an example. That too is up double and triple digits. We've had more WNBA countdowns. We had the big three on every ABC. Elchine Andrea, everybody knows the big three. It's my only big three. So more complementary coverage from a live broadcast standpoint and more storytelling and experiences across the board.
Yeah, and I think on the other side of it, it's also like, how are we taking advantage of all the investments we're making around technology and storytelling to make sure there's more personalization, there's more recommendations. Hey, we know you love college sports based on your viewership. What else could you be watching across our platform? Who is your favorite talent? How does that show up inside of your experience? Where can we recommend that you spend more time surfacing clips, surfacing your favorite talent? Really taking advantage of all of that personalization that is going to be served up through part of the new app experience to really leverage and bring forth the right storytelling, the right fandom, and the right brands to be part of that.
Are there brands that are strong supporters of women's sports that you've had to really look at as an example to pave the way for the way other brands kind of represent or jump into the women's sports game?
No question. I mean, like I said, Andrea Brimmer and Ally Bank, a model in terms of who showed up, but also Lorraine Tuhill at Google. Lorraine came to us and said, hey, I will spend more money with WNBA, but you got to put me on Windows on ABC. And so she changed how we actually were programming our network to make sure that those dollars could follow. So you had brands that really took, and by the way, this was 5 or 6 years ago when no one was doing that. Other brands have followed since then, Cap One, Eli Lilly. There are so many more brands who are showing up every single day saying, I want to be part of the conversation, but I also want to be part of the cultural shift that's going on in women's sports and making sure that I'm a leader and seen that way. Because again, we know women are loyal brand consumers, and those brands that show up have their loyalty for the rest of their lives.
Susie, is there anything else you want to touch on in terms of the way the business opportunities that are presented around women's sports and the way that is changing and the way ads are looking at it? Is there anything else you want to add?
I think Rita hit on it, right? There are a number of brands who have been invested from the jump and saw the business opportunity before the business opportunity was as robust as it is today. We want them all, though, right? We want all of those brands that haven't historically spent in women's sports to recognize the opportunity that exists. Everybody can come with us. There are a number of brands who have only spent in men's sports, and now they're trying to dip their toe in or recognize the opportunity that exists in women's sports. And there is opportunity for everyone. I think my role is unique in that I work horizontally across our business, and I really view myself as a bridge builder. We don't need everyone to have been an expert in women's sports, but we can help make you an expert in women's sports. We're not gatekeeping this incredible product, right? Maybe there's a lot of us who knew how good the product was for a really long time, but we want to bring everyone with us. We want everyone, again, to drive up the price, because spending more means more women get the bag. And that's really kind of the North Star at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think the leagues are also doing it, right? Like, I know Marissa was here from the NFL before. She and I were on a panel talking about this a couple of months ago, and they are firmly committed to figuring out how to support their female fans. The NBA is doing it. All of these leagues understand the importance of growth is tied to the growth of their female sports consumer. And so how they program, how they market, how they show up, what they're investing in terms of how they cover the game around the game, I think is going to be really important.
I'm asking you to see the future, which I realize is probably impossible. But as you've seen women's sports grow year after year, if you could look 5, 10 years down the road, what do you think we're going to be seeing from a vantage point of watching women's sports and the way it's growing exponentially?
More and more of it. It's going to be even more accessible. I care a lot about the experiences of it all. I always say my favorite in-person experience is the NFL draft because you get 250,000 plus fans in Green Bay, Wisconsin in April. I want to see that on the women's side. I want to see more of those experiences. I want to see more $100 million contracts. And I think I'm excited to leave the advocacy fully behind and just continue to focus on the business.
That's right. And I think you're going to be, when people say, hey, I was watching basketball, no one's going to assume it's men's anymore.
Yeah.
No one is going to assume, hey, I was
That's
watching
right.
this game.
That's
No
true.
one is going to assume you were watching the men play. They're going to assume you're watching women or men or, anything goes. I think the size of the audience growth on around women's sports is so strategically important for the growth of sports and the health of sports in this market that I think you're going to see more and more men tuning in, audiences tuning in, and in a couple of years, you're not going to, you will have to ask the question, what game was that last night?
Oh, yeah.
Because people will assume it could be either or.
Oh yeah, we have to correct ourselves all the time on air. Like we don't just say this game, that game, basketball. Like you definitely have to specify. All right. Well, this has been so fun. It has been very knowledgeable for me as well. So I really, Rita, Susie, thank you so much for all your expertise. For those of you watching the WNBA finals, continue to watch. Tune in. Go Aces.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you all. Thank you.